Steve and Kathy lay in bed, side by side, enveloped in the thick quiet of the night. Sleep seemed impossible. Kathy stared blankly at the ceiling, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. The air felt heavier tonight, thick and oppressive, as if something unseen was pressing down on them, watching. She tried to shake the feeling, but the unease only grew, gnawing at the edge of her mind. Steve, beside her, shifted uncomfortably, his own restlessness betraying the tension he felt but didn't speak of. His breathing was shallow, and though he didn't say it out loud, Kathy knew he felt it too. Something wasn't right. The clock on the nightstand ticked away, each second crawling by, amplifying the silence that filled the room. Finally, Steve broke the quiet, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Let's go for a drive." Kathy didn't argue. She nodded, relieved to escape the suffocating air inside the house. Maybe the open road would help clear her mind, or at the very least, offer a distraction. They quickly dressed, grabbed the car keys, and stepped outside into the cool night. But the stillness outside felt no better. The air was unnaturally still, with no wind, no sound, just the weight of the night bearing down on them. As they drove, the city lights faded into the distance, leaving only the deserted highway stretching out before them. The car's engine hummed steadily, the only sound breaking the eerie quiet. Kathy stared out the window, trying to focus on anything but the uneasy feeling that had followed them from the house. Yet, the further they drove, the worse it became. The trees lining the road loomed taller, their twisted branches casting unnatural shadows that seemed to shift and writhe in the corners of her vision. Steve kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing mile, and Kathy's unease bloomed into full-blown dread. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced with the irrational but unshakable feeling that they weren't alone. Something was out there, watching them, waiting. And then it happened, without warning, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. "Steve! Watch out!" Kathy screamed, her heart leaping into her throat. Steve slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches from the figure. Both of them sat frozen, their hearts pounding as they stared at the figure illuminated by the headlights. It was an old woman, her frail body wrapped in filthy, tattered clothes. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with deep-set eyes that seemed to sink into her skull. For a moment, they were paralyzed by shock. The woman stood there, unmoving, staring straight at them. The air in the car grew colder, and the stench of decay seeped in through the vents, turning Kathy's stomach. The woman slowly began to approach the car, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if her limbs didn't quite work the way they should. Kathy's hands shook as she clutched the edge of her seat, her instincts screaming at her to tell Steve to drive away, to leave this woman behind. But before she could say anything, Steve rolled down the window just enough to hear her. "Please," the woman croaked, her voice thin and rasping. "I need a ride. I live at a farmhouse nearby. I've been walking for hours." Kathy wanted to scream no, to tell Steve to step on the gas and leave this woman in the dark. But Steve, perhaps out of pity, nodded. "Get in," he said, though his voice was tight with unease. The woman shuffled to the back of the car and climbed in. As soon as the door closed behind her, the atmosphere in the car changed. The air turned thick, and a wave of cold, putrid air washed over them. It was the smell of rot, of something long dead. Kathy gagged, trying to hold back the rising nausea. The temperature seemed to plummet, and the silence returned, even heavier than before. Steve gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he stared straight ahead, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. He tried to start a conversation, but the words caught in his throat. The oppressive presence in the back seat suffocated any attempt at small talk. Kathy, against her better judgment, glanced into the rearview mirror. The woman sat unnaturally still, her face hidden in the shadows, but Kathy could feel her eyes watching. Her skin crawled as the woman's gaze bore into her from the darkness. She quickly looked away, her heart racing. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of them, as if they were trapped in some kind of nightmarish loop, driving further into a void with no end. Steve's voice broke the silence, shaky and uncertain. "We'll drop you off at the petrol station up ahead." But even as he said it, Kathy knew something was terribly wrong. The drive felt endless, like time itself had slowed to a crawl, each second stretching into eternity. The weight pressing down on them was suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Kathy's hand trembled as she reached over to grip Steve's arm, but neither of them spoke. They both knew something was horribly, dreadfully wrong. Finally, after what felt like hours, the flickering lights of a petrol station appeared in the distance. Steve pulled in, parking near the edge of the lot, his relief palpable. "Here we are," he muttered, his voice hollow. He kept his eyes fixed on the steering wheel, unwilling to turn around, unwilling to look at the woman sitting behind them. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The woman didn't move. The stench of decay hung thick in the air, and Kathy's heart pounded in her chest as she waited, every second stretched thin by the overwhelming tension. Then, without a word, the woman opened the door and stepped out. Kathy watched through the rearview mirror as she shuffled toward the edge of the lot, her frail figure dissolving into the darkness beyond the flickering lights. Steve exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he reached for the gear shift. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. But Kathy couldn't shake the feeling clawing at her insides. "Wait," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just look back. Make sure she's really gone." Reluctantly, Steve glanced over his shoulder. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat. The woman was gone. Completely vanished. Kathy's pulse quickened as she spun around in her seat, her eyes scanning the empty lot. There was no sign of the woman. It had been mere seconds, there was no way she could have disappeared so quickly. But there was nothing. No shadow, no movement, no trace of her at all. The stench of rot still lingered, thick and unbearable, clinging to them like a curse. Steve's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes wide with disbelief. This isn't right. This isn't possible. Kathy's stomach twisted in knots. "We need to leave. Now." Steve nodded, turning the key in the ignition. But instead of the comforting hum of the engine, there was only a sputter, followed by a sickening silence. The dashboard lights flickered once before plunging them into complete darkness. Panic set in. Steve frantically tried to turn the key again, but the car remained dead, the engine refusing to start. Kathy's breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. "What's happening?" she gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. Then, from the darkness outside, a soft scraping sound reached their ears. Faint at first, barely audible. But it grew louder, closer, like something, or someone, was circling the car. Steve fumbled for his phone, his trembling fingers barely able to grasp it. The weak, flickering light from the screen illuminated his terrified face as he angled it toward the rearview mirror. For a split second, his breath caught in his throat. The woman was there, standing just outside the car window. Her pale, gaunt face was pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes wide and unblinking. A grotesque smile twisted her lips, the skin of her face stretching unnaturally as she stared at them. Kathy screamed, her voice piercing the silence as Steve slammed his foot on the gas. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, speeding away from the petrol station and into the endless night. But no matter how fast they drove, the image of the woman burned in their minds, her eyes following them, her twisted smile haunting every shadow they passed. They didn't speak on the way home. The silence between them was thick with fear, their bodies trembling, their minds racing with the impossibility of what they had just witnessed. Kathy clutched her seat, her heart still pounding as they finally pulled into their driveway. Steve turned off the engine, and for a moment, they sat in stunned silence, unwilling to move, unwilling to believe what had just happened. But deep down, they both knew the truth. They hadn't left her behind. Something had come with them. Something dark. Something evil. The stench of rot clung to them, seeping into the walls of their home, into the air they breathed. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, as though the very house itself had absorbed the presence of the old woman. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights sent chills down their spines, reminding them that they were never truly alone. That night, Kathy couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her heart racing, her ears straining to catch every sound. And then she heard it, a soft tapping at the window. Slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was waiting outside. Steve was beside her, wide awake, his breath shallow and fast. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Kathy nodded, her body frozen with fear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was joined by a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of their own racing hearts. And then came the footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps just outside their bedroom door. The old woman had followed them home. And she wasn't leaving. The nights that followed were filled with terror. The smell of decay became stronger, the coldness in the air more pronounced. The haunting was relentless. Kathy would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, only to see the old woman standing at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes locked on her, that same twisted smile stretching across her pale face. Steve tried to deny it at first, but as the days passed, he too began to see her, feel her presence everywhere they went. The lights flickered constantly, objects moved on their own, and the air was always heavy with the scent of death. No matter what they did, they couldn't escape her. She was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Desperate, Kathy began to research the road where they had picked up the woman. She scoured the internet, combing through local legends and old news reports. Finally, she found it, a story about a farmhouse that had burned down decades ago, with only one survivor, an old woman who had been found wandering the road, her mind broken by the tragedy. She had died shortly after, her body never properly buried. Steve didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. They had picked up her spirit, and now she was bound to them. They tried everything, prayers, blessings, even a spiritual cleansing. But nothing worked. The haunting only grew stronger, more violent. The woman's presence was everywhere, her laughter echoing in their ears, her twisted smile burned into their minds. One night, they decided to confront her, to face the terror head-on. They returned to the place where they had picked her up, hoping to put her spirit to rest. But as they stood there, in the cold, silent night, they realized it was too late. She was never going to leave. And neither were they.